Hey guys, so today we are going to talk about a phenomenon that I find as an interesting thought. Basically, it's called the handler in object-oriented programming. So let's get into it. Now, let's give you a bit of context first and foremost. You may or may not be aware of that in object-oriented programming, or at least enterprise-level object-oriented programming, we have this concept called a domain-driven design. Now, what is a domain-driven design, you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, domain-driven design works on the idea that using OOP, you model out your system. Basically, if your system is something along the lines of a business, say you're selling books, then you would have an object that represents a user, you would have an object representing like a book, and an object representing an order, for example. And you might even have an object representing a payment. You see these nouns, like these descriptive words, they fall very nicely into the natural language, the domain language, if you will, of your business problem or your business domain. So that's where this idea of domain-driven design comes from, where you basically just try to model reality or your problem domain in object-oriented programming. Now, this works extremely well, in my opinion. It's something that is very natural to us. It feels very intuitive. And what's even better is, this is me just guessing, my guess is that this was, like, you may know about the concept of UML or flowcharts. Now, if you think about this model that I just described for you, these domain objects and the connections between them, because a user is connected to a order and an order is connected to a product, or depending on how you look at it, a product and a user is connected to the order, and the order has a payment. Like, these things are very easily connected and associated. Think of it as a whiteboard. You can draw boxes and draw lines and very easily express on a whiteboard how the system works as a whole. This is what I believe to be the reason as to why, well, not the only reason, of course, but I think this is a major reason as to why object-oriented programming got such massive adoption and is still one of the favorite methodologies of working, or at least domain-driven design is one of the favorite. I don't even think I've ever been in a project where this is not the norm. Anywho, now, where am I going with this? Well, you see, in my experience, this is the sort of issue, there's actually a big issue with this way of working. Can you see it? Let me give you my perspective on this. You see, in my example, we have a very easy model. A very, very easy model. The system, what I just described to you, is a very simple system. And that's usually how it starts out. It's very, very common that domain-driven design starts out as this beautiful, simple thing because the system in of itself is so simple. But when you start scaling up, you start realizing that you have all these. You might have a user, and then you have different roles. You have an admin, and then you might have a VIP user, and a gold member card user, and a silver card member user. But you can be a gold card holder and a silver card holder at the same time. And then you can, of course, be on the VIP list at the same time, but you have different rules depending on if you're a gold card member and a silver card member. And if you're both at the same time, you have certain rules that apply and override other. You can get really complicated really quickly. And that's where the domain-driven design kind of falls apart very quickly. And you know that your domain model is starting to fall apart when you have seen, or not, it doesn't have to be the first time you see it, but when you start seeing people naming some of their objects as handlers, a user handler, a user order handler, something of that nature, you see things start to fall apart. That's at least from my experience, because now the domain or the problem that you're solving has grown to the point where you can no longer in natural language express what it is that you want to express with the class or the object or whatever you're creating. You can't just express it in a nice, elegant way anymore. This happens, in my experience, in every single non-trivial project. So, what does this mean? Why am I stating things such as this? What's the big revelation here? Well, you see, the reason why I want to touch on this is because I had this discussion with an old co-worker of mine. We were talking about the benefits of functional programming as opposed to object-oriented programming. He made the very accurate statement: anything you can do in functional programming, you can do in object-oriented programming. And I agree. For the most part, these are different styles of solving problems. There's really, like, you can solve them in both approaches. But I argue that in certain situations, one solution makes more sense than another solution. This is one such instance. In my experience, when you have an object that is called a handler, that is you, at least from what I have seen so far in my career, that is you wanting to, for the most part, create a suite or some type of what I call in-between or cross-cutting, well, not cross-cutting, but an in-between solution to your domain. In other words, this is a handler is a object or a container of functionality that does not fit in any of your user models or your product models or so forth. It doesn't naturally fit into your domain. And that's where functional programming comes in. What you're trying to do is that you're trying to use object-oriented programming to solve something that very naturally would have been solved, in my experience, with functional programming. Because what you want for a handler usually just contains one or two methods, and that's usually it. It's just responsible for doing something that does not fall into the domain or to any of your models. And that's a function, my friend, for the most part. Now, this is where I try to kind of give you an example of being what I call pragmatic. Being die-hard object-oriented or being die-hard functional is, in my experience, never a good thing. What you should always consider is whether or not the problem becomes more complex with your solution as opposed to becoming simpler. So when you are modeling out your system in the beginning, because I argue that you shouldn't, I mean, object-oriented programming and domain-driven design, as I said, it's a great thing. It's very simple to understand, it's very simple to adopt for any business. But when you reach a certain size, you need to start going outside of the mental prison that you create around yourself, because that's what I find that a lot of people do. You start thinking in terms of only using the domain that you have provided to you, and it's not the right way, guys. And as I said, when you start adding a lot of handlers, anything like that, handlers, dispatchers, like all these different concepts, and you try to model that as a part of your domain, you're on the, I argue you should have a rethink. Consider taking just having a look at how functional programming would solve those sorts of issues. Because what I like to do is that whenever I'm trying to make a handler, unless I have the need to store some type of data in a field variable or something inside of my object, I just try to make it a static method. And now I was drilled into, like, I was really put down for this in my object-oriented class back in my university days. My teachers told me, you should at no point, you should always avoid using static methods. You should just try to make it part of your object. And I kind of said, well, yeah, but there are, in my opinion, situations where I don't want my method to be part of my object. I just want to, like, it doesn't fall into my model. I don't want to have to instantiate an entire object to handle something. Like, as I said, like, there are certain situations where I don't want an entire object to do the thing that I'm looking for. I just want the function, and I should be able to do that in object-oriented programming. I personally don't believe that object-oriented programming means that I only use objects all the damn time. I still believe this to this day. And as I said, when you are creating handler objects with like a single method, have a rethink. Does this really need to be an object? Because just because you're working in an OOP fashion, that doesn't mean that every single thing has to be an object. Just have a think about it, and have a great day.